Millionaire sees a young woman praying for his son in a coma, and he fell in love with her. That morning, rain fell quietly over the narrow streets leading to St. Mary's Hospital, an old, weathered building on the edge of a small coastal town in the eastern United States. Raindrops slid down fogged-up window panes, mingling with the dim yellow glow of the hallway lights, casting a solemn, almost sacred atmosphere. Ethan Ward stood by the hospital room window, staring at the rain-soaked parking lot below, his heart heavy. Once a renowned neurosurgeon, a man every patient trusted, all that prestige had meant nothing since the accident nearly a year ago. His 9-year-old son, Chris, had been in a deep coma ever since their car was struck head-on by an out-of-control driver. His wife, Laura, had passed away from cancer 2 years before that. Loss had followed loss, leaving Ethan in a hollow life where each day was reduced to just two things: working and sitting by his son's bedside. The clock on the wall read 7:15 a.m. Ethan left the room to grab a coffee from the cafeteria. When he returned and reached the door, he froze. Through the small gap of the door left ajar, he saw a woman kneeling beside Chris's bed. She wore the simple uniform of a cafeteria worker, a faded blue shirt, khaki pants, and an apron dusted with traces of flour. Her brown hair was tied neatly back, her hands clasped together, trembling slightly. Her lips moved silently, yet her face carried an inexplicable sense of peace. Ethan tightened his grip on the doorknob. He didn't know her, had never seen her before. Why would a complete stranger be here with his son, praying with such devotion? A mixture of curiosity and caution stirred inside him. Ethan stood still for a few more seconds before gently pushing the door open. The hinges creaked softly, and the woman startled, lifting her head. Her brown eyes widened, but there was no trace of fear in them. "I'm sorry," Ethan began, his voice harsher and colder than he had intended. "What are you doing here?" The woman slowly stood up, untying the apron from behind her back. "I was praying for the boy," she said, her tone soft yet steady. "Praying?" Ethan frowned. "Do you know him?" She shook her head. "No, but I felt I needed to. My name is Grace Miller. I work in the cafeteria on the first floor." Ethan's gaze didn't leave her. "Why?" Grace stayed silent for a few seconds, as if weighing her words. 4 years ago, I lost my daughter Emily in an accident. She was the same age Chris is now. Since then, I've never stopped feeling this emptiness inside me. The day Chris was brought here, I happened to pass by this room. Just one look, and I knew I had to pray for him whenever I could. Ethan clenched his jaw slightly, partly out of emotion, partly because he still didn't trust her. "What do you want? Money? Something else?" Grace froze for a moment, then gave a faint, sorrowful smile. "No, Dr. Ward. I don't want anything. I have no one left to love. So I give that love to those who need it. Chris needs someone to believe for him, and I have faith to give." Her words left Ethan silent. He turned to Chris, the small face still peaceful in his long sleep, the medical equipment beeping in steady rhythm. Then looked back at Grace. "Thank you, but I'd appreciate it if you asked me first before coming in here again." Ethan's tone had softened, though the distance remained. Grace nodded. "I understand, and if you find me bothersome, I can pray somewhere else. But I won't stop praying for Chris." As she left the room, Ethan remained standing, a swirl of conflicting feelings rising within him. In his mind, the image of that ordinary woman, hands trembling but eyes so serene, kept appearing over and over. In the days that followed, Ethan didn't try to talk to Grace again, but he began to notice her more. Each morning on his way to the cafeteria, he saw her serving breakfast to hospital staff and patients. No noise, no theatrics. Grace worked slowly, attentively, pouring coffee, wiping the counter, offering a gentle smile to whoever stood before her. During her lunch break, Ethan often noticed her leaving the cafeteria a few minutes early, carrying a small notebook. She would head to the pediatric ward, stopping by various rooms to chat with young patients. When she came to Chris's room, Grace never rushed. She'd pull up a chair, check if the blanket was in place, sometimes smoothing his hair with the ease of someone who'd done it countless times. Once, Ethan stood in the hallway and heard her say, "Good afternoon, Chris. It's raining today, but it's warm in here, isn't it? Yesterday your cousin came by and told me you love apple pie. Today I'm going to pray that you wake up soon, so you can have some of my apple pie." The way Grace spoke to Chris, as if he were awake and listening, unsettled Ethan. It had been so long since he himself had talked to his son like that. One afternoon, while Chris was being examined, Ethan happened to run into Grace in the hallway. She greeted him, and this time he stopped. "You do this every day?" Grace smiled. "Whenever I can. I believe Chris can hear, even if he can't respond." Ethan was quiet for a few seconds, then blurted out, "Do you really believe prayer can change anything?" "I believe love can. Prayer is just how I speak that love out loud." Her answer stayed with Ethan all night. As he sat by his son's bed, he realized he had forgotten what it felt like to put faith in something. The next day, during a lunch break, when he saw Grace enter Chris's room, Ethan followed. She looked slightly surprised, but didn't ask. She simply pulled up an extra chair beside him. When her hands gently took Chris's small hand and she began her prayer, Ethan listened. At first it felt foreign, but within minutes something inside him eased. And for the first time in nearly a year, Ethan closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm here, son." And from that moment, something in Ethan began to shift. Not a sudden explosion, but a quiet undercurrent, slowly weaving its way into each breath he took. At lunchtime, Ethan continued to sit and listen as Grace prayed, sometimes in silence, sometimes nodding slightly when her words touched him. Then, on a Thursday morning, while talking with Grace at Chris's bedside, Ethan noticed Chris's heart rate on the monitor rise just a little higher than usual. Not much, but enough to catch his attention. "The numbers are slightly different," he murmured, as if afraid to wake his son. Grace glanced at the screen, then smiled softly. "Maybe he's listening to us." That day, Chris's attending physician also noted a few positive signs: mild muscle reflexes, steadier breathing. Though Ethan knew better than to hope too soon, a small light still slipped in. That evening, when he told Grace about it, she said, "Hope isn't a guarantee, Dr. Ward. It's just a door left ajar. We can still walk through it." Her words lingered in Ethan's mind, but not everyone was pleased to see Grace's presence. Clara Ward, Ethan's practical and outspoken sister, came to visit Chris over the weekend. When she saw Grace in the room, Clara immediately pulled Ethan into the hallway. "Who is she, and why is she here with Chris?" "Grace works in the cafeteria. She comes to pray for him." "Ethan, are you sure about this? You're vulnerable right now, and someone like that could take advantage of it." Ethan tried to explain, but Clara wouldn't listen. When they returned to the room, Clara gave Grace a curt nod, her eyes filled with suspicion. Grace didn't react. She kept her gentle smile and continued her conversation with Chris as if no one else was there. The way she held her composure without defending herself only made Ethan more puzzled and more unable to look away. Clara didn't take long to show her displeasure. That afternoon, when Ethan stepped out to take a call, leaving only Clara and Grace in the room, the air instantly grew heavy. Clara stood with her arms crossed by the door, her gaze cold as she looked at the woman sitting beside Chris's bed. "You're Grace, right?" Clara spoke evenly, but with an edge beneath her tone. Grace looked up and gave a small nod. "Yes." "You know who Ethan is, don't you? A well-known doctor from a well-off family. And right now, my brother is at his weakest. Do you think I can't see what you're trying to do?" Grace tilted her head slightly, her voice still calm. "I'm not sure what you mean. You're trying to get close to my brother, taking advantage of his kindness and his pain." "I've seen this kind of thing before." Clara's words were blunt. Grace was silent for a few seconds before gently replying, "I understand you're protective of your brother. If I were in your place, I might think the same. But I don't want anything from Ethan. I just want to pray for Chris." Clara let out a dry laugh. No one does something for someone else without wanting something in return. Grace met Clara's eyes, not with defiance, but with a deep, quiet sadness. Some things are done purely out of love, even if the person you love can never give anything back. For a brief moment, Clara seemed caught off guard, but before she could say anything else, Ethan returned to the room. His eyes moved quickly between the two women, sensing the tension. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Nothing," Grace smiled, standing up. "I'll let you two talk." As she left the room, Grace glanced at Clara, not with resentment, but as if to say, "I am not your enemy." After that tense conversation, Clara remained cautious, but Ethan noticed something different in her eyes, not entirely closed off anymore, but as if she were watching, waiting for an answer from reality. In the following days, Clara kept coming to the hospital. At first, she would stand quietly in the corner, observing as Grace spoke or prayed by Chris's side. But one afternoon, while Grace was telling Chris a funny story from her school days, Ethan caught a faint upward curve at the corner of Clara's mouth. No one said anything, but he knew. The thin layer of ice between them was starting to crack. And then, on a Saturday morning, everything changed. As the three of them, Ethan, Clara, and Grace, stood together by Chris's bed, something happened that none of them could have expected. That Saturday morning, rare sunlight filtered through the window, falling across the bed where Chris lay. Ethan sat on the left, Clara stood at the foot of the bed, and Grace was on the right, her hands gently holding the boy's small hand. Grace began to pray, her voice slow and warm. "Lord, please keep Chris safe, and if it is your will for him to open his eyes, let that day come closer." Ethan watched quietly, the familiar weight of helplessness settling in his chest. But then he noticed something different. Chris's fingers moved, very slightly, but undeniably. "Grace, did you see that?" Ethan asked softly, his voice trembling. Grace paused, looking down. Yes. The boy's hand twitched again, this time a little stronger. Clara stepped closer, her eyes wide. "Ethan." "I know," Ethan said, his gaze fixed on Chris. "Chris, can you hear me, son?" There was no answer, but on the monitor his heart rate rose slightly. Grace placed her free hand on Ethan's shoulder, her eyes glistening. Clara stood still, and for the first time in months, the suspicion on her face vanished entirely. After a few tense seconds, Chris lay still again, but for Ethan, each movement felt like a promise. He turned to Grace, unable to hide his emotion. "Thank you for believing, even when I didn't." Grace smiled, though her eyes held both weariness and joy. Sometimes faith needs two people to carry it, when one gets tired. Her words made Clara look at Grace longer than usual before she gave a small nod, a subtle gesture, but for Ethan, it was acceptance. That afternoon, when only the two of them remained, Ethan and Grace sat in the quiet room. He told her about Laura, about his wife's final days, and about his fear of not being able to protect the people he loved. Grace listened without interrupting. When he fell silent, she said, "I know what loss feels like too, but loss doesn't take away our ability to love unless we let it." Ethan looked into her eyes and realized what he had been avoiding all along. He wasn't just grateful to Grace. He had fallen in love with her. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around Chris's hospital room changed noticeably. Ethan and Grace still spoke softly by the bedside, and Clara no longer kept her cold distance, occasionally even asking Grace a few small questions. Chris's health indicators continued to stabilize. Though there was still no sign of him waking, each bit of progress felt like another thread woven into the fragile fabric of hope. Ethan began to smile more often. Grace could feel that he was lighter than before, though the shadow of worry still lingered in his eyes. But then, just as everything seemed to be slowly getting better, the door swung open. Daniel Price, Ethan's longtime colleague and close friend, stepped in. Daniel gave Ethan a quick handshake, but the glance he threw toward Grace was anything but friendly. And when he spoke, their story took a completely different turn. Daniel walked in, set his briefcase on the table, and turned to Ethan. "We need to talk." Ethan glanced at Grace, but Daniel quickly added, "Alone." Grace understood, nodded, and stood. As she passed Daniel, she offered a polite smile, but he only returned a curt nod, his eyes cold. Once the door closed, Daniel leaned on the table, bending forward. "Ethan, what the hell are you doing? You're one of the best neurosurgeons in the region. Your reputation isn't just yours, it affects the entire hospital. And now you're being seen spending time with a cafeteria worker?" Ethan crossed his arms, keeping his tone steady. "Grace is a good person. She's been here for Chris, supporting me, and—" Daniel cut him off. "I don't care how good she is. In the eyes of others, this will be taken the wrong way. Rumors will spread. You'll lose patience, lose trust. And when the board hears about it, they won't go easy on you." Ethan frowned. "You're talking like I've done something wrong." Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I've seen this before, Ethan. People show up when you're at your weakest. They act kind, but in the end, they always want something." Ethan clenched his fists. "Grace isn't like that." "Are you sure? How long have you known her? A month? 2? Daniel emphasized each word. "I'm trying to save you before this gets out of hand." Ethan stood tall. "Daniel, I don't need you to save me. If you can't trust me, then you're not really my friend." The air grew heavy. Daniel was silent for a few seconds, then gathered his papers and headed for the door. But before leaving, he turned back. "You'll regret this, Ethan. Trust me." The door slammed shut, leaving Ethan alone in the dim office. For a moment, he stood still, his hand on the doorknob, trying to steady his breath. The hallway outside was hushed, lit only by the fading glow of the late afternoon sun. Each step back toward the ward felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted him. Daniel's words echoed in his mind. The warnings, the accusations. A part of him wondered if there was even a grain of truth in them. But then he saw in memory Grace's hands gently holding Chris's, her quiet voice telling stories as if the boy could hear every word. No, he thought, that's not someone I'll turn away from. As he neared the pediatric wing, Ethan caught fragments of conversation from 2 nurses by the corner. Administration, reassignment list, pediatrics too. The words snagged his attention, sending a cold ripple through him. By the time he reached Chris's room, the uneasy feeling had settled deep in his chest. Moments later, the news arrived. Grace would be reassigned to another ward starting next week. When Chris learned of it, though still unconscious, his vital signs dipped slightly. Ethan sat by his son's bed, looking at him, and knew he would not let anyone take away the woman who had brought hope back to both of them. The news of Grace's reassignment reached Chris on a quiet afternoon. Clara was reading by his bedside when Grace came in, sat down, and softly said, "Chris, I'll be working in another ward soon, but I'll still pray for you every day." Though the boy's eyes remained closed, the numbers on the monitor suddenly fluctuated. His heart rate spiked, then dropped erratically. The blood pressure monitor issued a mild alert. Clara quickly pressed the call button for a nurse while Grace held tightly to Chris's hand. "It's okay. I'm still here. I'm not going far." Ethan rushed in, glanced at the monitor, then at Grace. Their eyes met. No words needed. He understood Chris was reacting to the news. That evening, Ethan went to Daniel's office. He didn't knock. He walked straight in. Daniel looked up, frowning. "Ethan, what? What did you tell the board about Grace?" Ethan's voice was low, but the anger beneath it was tightly restrained. Daniel folded his arms. "I told them the truth. She's a distraction. I'm protecting you." "Protecting?" Ethan stepped closer. Chris just had a negative reaction when he learned Grace was being reassigned. His health declined over that alone. "If you were really my friend, you wouldn't touch the person who's been helping save my son." Daniel shrugged. "Ethan, you're letting emotions drive you. Don't let personal feelings ruin your career." "No." Ethan cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "I'll make this clear once. Either you retract what you told the board and let Grace stay, or our friendship ends here. And I won't hesitate to tell everyone exactly why." Daniel was silent for a few seconds, his eyes flickering. Finally, he exhaled. "Your choice, Ethan, but don't say I didn't warn you." Ethan didn't answer. He simply turned and walked out, slamming the door, leaving Daniel alone this time. After the confrontation with Daniel, Ethan returned to Chris's room. Grace was still there, sitting by the bed, her eyes red but forcing a smile when she saw him. Ethan pulled up a chair, took her hand. "I talked to Daniel. I'm not letting anyone take you away." Grace shook her head slightly. "Ethan, this isn't just about me. This is your job, your reputation. I don't want to be the reason you lose anything. You've given me and Chris something we've both lost for a long time. Hope. I'm not trading that away for anything." His voice was firm, with no hesitation left. They sat in silence for a moment, the steady beeping of the monitor filling the room. Then Ethan said quietly, "Tomorrow, I want you here. You, me, and Clara. We'll be with Chris." Grace nodded, and in that moment, neither of them knew that tomorrow would bring what they had been waiting for nearly a year. That morning, the first sunlight after days of rain streamed softly through the window, falling across the bed where Chris lay. Ethan had been there since early, his eyes never leaving his son. Grace entered carrying a vase of white daisies, a gentle smile on her lips. Clara came too, this time without suspicion in her gaze, replaced instead by a rare calm. The three of them stood around Chris's bed. Grace took his small hand, whispering a quiet prayer. "Lord, please give Chris the strength to open his eyes, to return to those who love him." Ethan bowed his head, this time murmuring along. Clara stood at the foot of the bed, her eyes glistening as if holding something back. Suddenly, Chris's fingers squeezed Grace's hand. Ethan looked up instantly, his heart skipping a beat. "Chris?" he called, his voice trembling. The boy's eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, as if pushing through a heavy dream. Familiar brown eyes, still glazed with sleep, searched the room before locking on his father's face, and in that instant they seemed to shine. "Dad?" His voice was raspy, fragile as a whisper carried by the wind, yet it broke through the silence like a bell. Ethan pulled his son into his arms, tears streaming down his face. Clara turned away, quietly wiping her eyes. After a moment, Chris turned to Grace. I saw Mom, and a girl named Emily. Mom said, 'Miss Grace will be my new mom.'" Grace covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan looked at her, his own eyes wet but steady. He stood, walked to the other side of the bed, and knelt down on one knee right in front of her. "Grace Miller," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "You've saved my son and my heart. I don't want to wait another day to ask, will you marry me?" Grace froze, still holding tightly to Chris's hand. The boy gave a faint smile. "She has to say yes, Dad." The room erupted in laughter through tears. Grace's eyes brimmed with tears as she nodded, her voice trembling but certain. "Yes, Ethan. With all my heart, I will." Ethan took her hand and placed a gentle kiss on it. Clara stepped forward, wrapping her arms around them both. In that moment, the room once filled with the hum of machines became warm and bright, overflowing with tears and laughter, a new family beginning in the very place where it once seemed only loss could live. And from the moment Grace said, "Yes," everything seemed to change, not just in Ethan's eyes or in Chris's smile, but in the very air of that hospital room. It was no longer a place of sorrow, but the starting point of a new story. In the weeks that followed, hope seemed to breathe life into every corner of their days. Chris's laughter began to fill the halls again, and Ethan and Grace found themselves speaking more about the future than the past. So when the idea of a wedding came, there was no question where it would be held. 2 months after the day Chris woke up, the small chapel in the hospital grounds was decorated with white flowers and flickering candles. This was the very place where the miracle had happened, and Ethan and Grace wanted to begin their new life exactly where their story had changed. The ceremony was simple but warm. The wooden pews were filled with hospital staff, close friends, and even patients Grace had once cared for. Chris's doctor, the head nurse, and even the janitors were there, smiling, many with tears in their eyes. Chris walked in wearing a tiny suit, carrying a red velvet pillow with 2 wedding rings on top. He proudly made his way down the aisle, his eyes shining as he glanced between his father and Grace. When the sound of the organ began, Grace appeared in a simple white dress, holding a bouquet of white daisies. Ethan stood waiting at the end of the aisle, his heart pounding like the first time he saw her praying by his son's bed. The minister began with a few words about the journey from despair to happiness that everyone here had witnessed. Ethan took Grace's hands, his voice trembling slightly as he said his vows. "You came when I no longer believed in anything, gave me hope, and gave my son a reason to fight. I promise to love you, protect you, and face any challenge with you, just as we have since the very beginning." Grace looked at him, tears running down her cheeks. "You and Chris have filled the space I thought would never be filled again. I promise to love you both, not only in sunny days, but in stormy nights too." Applause erupted as they exchanged rings. Ethan leaned down, kissing Grace as the room cheered. Chris threw his hands in the air. "My mom and dad just got married." In that moment, the hospital chapel, once a place of desperate prayers, was now filled with laughter, tears, and the unshakable belief that miracles are real. And then, as the laughter in the chapel faded, the rhythm of their lives began to change. Days in the hospital turned into days of planning, dreaming, and finding a place to call their own. Soon they found it, a small house by the sea where mornings would greet them with sunlight and nights would end with the hush of waves. A new chapter of the story began, not of hospitals, machines, and worry, but of fresh mornings, the sound of ocean waves, and the gentle rhythm of family life. A few months after the wedding, Ethan, Grace, and Chris moved into a small house near the ocean. The house was painted white with a blue-tiled roof, its wide windows open to let in the breeze and the salty scent of the sea. From the porch they could watch the sunrise every morning and listen to the waves at night. Ethan continued working at the hospital, but he made it a priority to be home for dinner with his family every evening. On weekends, he and Chris would play ball on the sandy shore or help Grace fix the old porch swing. Once their new life settled, Grace enrolled in nursing school. She wanted to turn her compassion into professional skill to help more patients. Whenever she had homework, Chris would sit at the table beside her, working too by drawing fish or boats. Chris was healthier and happier than ever. He especially loved cooking with Grace, cutting vegetables, washing fruit, or tending to the white daisies in the garden, the flowers that had been present in almost every special moment of their family's story. One spring evening, as the three of them were having dinner, Grace smiled at Ethan and Chris. "There's something I want to tell you both." Ethan set down his fork, tilting his head. "What is it?" Grace placed a hand on her stomach, her eyes shining. "Our family is about to have a new member." Chris's eyes widened, then he jumped from his chair, wrapping his arms around Grace. "I'm going to be a big brother." Ethan joined in, wrapping both of them in his arms, feeling as if his heart might burst. In their small seaside home, surrounded by the sound of waves and the scent of flowers, they knew that miracles don't happen just once. They continue in every meal shared, every smile, and every moment spent together. One summer morning, the sky was clear and cloudless. Ethan, Grace, and Chris prepared a large bouquet of white daisies and drove together to a cemetery about 15 minutes from town. The first grave they visited was Laura's, Ethan's late wife and Chris's mother. The bouquet was placed neatly before the headstone, which bore her name and a familiar smile. Ethan knelt down and softly said, "Laura, thank you for every moment you loved and raised Chris. I believe that somewhere you're smiling, seeing how strong our boy has become and how he's learning to laugh again." Chris sat beside him, resting his hand on the stone. "Mom, I miss you so much. I saw you in a dream, and you told me to live well. I promise I will." They stayed silent for a few minutes, letting the wind rustle the trees, carrying the scent of flowers and the sound of birdsong. Next, the family walked to another grave, Emily's, Grace's daughter. Grace placed the rest of the flowers on the grave, her eyes tender but glistening. "Emily, I've found a family you would love. Ethan and Chris, they've healed my heart. I believe you and Laura brought us together from heaven." Ethan wrapped his arms around Grace, while Chris stood close, placing his small hand over his stepmother's. Before leaving, the three stood quietly for a moment, looking up at the sky. In the sunlight, they whispered their thanks to the unseen guardians who had guided them to each other. That afternoon, they returned home and walked to the beach together. The sun was setting, painting the water gold. Ethan held Grace's hand, Grace held Chris's, and the three walked along the wet sand. No one spoke much. The waves rolled in and out, the cool water brushing over their feet. Above them, the sky stretched wide and endless, like the future ahead. They all knew this was not the end, but the beginning of a new journey, where love, hope, and memories would always walk beside them.